We are really happy to have Mr. Doug Gucker here with us tonight. Doug is a local food systems and small farms educator with University of Illinois Extension, serving DeWitt, Macon, and Piatt counties. He improves producer profitability and sustainability through demonstration and programming focused on using appropriate management strategies in all aspects of production. His work demonstrates practices in the area of farm management, soil health, nutrient management, integrated pest management, and grazing. Doug's other interests are agricultural entrepreneurship, beekeeping, cover crops, native prairie restorations, water quality with regard to agriculture, urban farming systems, and local foods. His previous work experience includes agricultural technical service representative, small Illinois grain and livestock farmer, and natural resources conservation agronomist. So we're happy to have you here with us tonight, Doug.
Sounds like I need a hobby.
Beekeeping, there you go.
well, thank you, Grant. And I just want to, as we get started, say that this is an overview of grazing, because obviously in 1 hour, I cannot do the specifics of grazing the justice they need. I've been to workshops that lasted 2 full days, and they were considered overviews of grazing. So with that, I'll get started. So what is grazing? Grazing is allowing livestock to directly consume the growing forage. Forage is grasses, legumes, and forbs. Forbs are broadleaves. In a pasture. At a simpler scale, it's harvesting forage by animal instead of machines. Grazing provides good nutrition and other benefits to the animal that's grazing, and it can lead to more productive forage growth. However, grazing requires management. You need to manage the forage. Are they consuming it evenly, or are you getting overgrazed spots where they're grazing it down to the ground? Or are you having areas that are undergrazed, and you begin to notice in June and July that it's going to seed, it's getting stemmy and brown, and the animals aren't even going to those areas to feed. The other thing we need to manage is the animals. How are they looking? Their condition. How are they looking? Nice shiny coats, bright eyes. They seem to be moving well, paying attention. And of course, with any animal, you have to pay attention to their health. So there's several types of grazing, types and styles of grazing. And I chose 4. There are more than this, and there are combinations of these. So continuous grazing, as I like to tell people, that's the Norman Rockwell picture of grazing. Animals standing out in a field with fenced in, and they just have all this land that they can walk over and eat on. We don't utilize the forage very well when we do that, and we tend to end up with overgrazed and undergrazed areas, and you end up needing to buy a mower. Rotational grazing. And there's rotational grazing, there's managed grazing, there's adaptive grazing. These are all just different terms for subdividing our larger pasture into smaller areas, or paddocks, they're officially called. And the animals move into these areas, they graze them down, and when they reach the forage reaches a level, or then they're moved on to another area, and this allows the forage to recover, and so the animals are always eating a nutritious type of forage that they consume well and they can grow well on. Creep grazing, that's used when you have mothers and their young, so like a cow-calf operation, a ewe and lamb operation. And we put an opening in the fence that allows the young animals to move through and eat the young tender grass on the other side of the fence. Yet they're still in view of their mothers, and the mothers are still in view of their young. And so the young animals get to eat the best forage out there. And as soon as they have consumed what the good forage over there, then you take the fence down, or you move the fence and allow the mother animals in to finish off grazing that land. And finally, there's multi-species grazing. This is where we'll have cattle and sheep or goats a lot of times grazing together. And I'll get to because each type of animal has a preference for different plant types. And so this can be quite helpful in getting a uniform grazing of a pasture. So if you're going to have a pasture, you're going to have fences because you have to keep the animals in somehow. Yes, we're developing systems where animals wear collars and there isn't a physical fence up, but it still isn't quite perfect yet. So we're still relying on physical fencing. So we've got the old traditional barbed wire fence uh, developed back in the late 1800s. It was said to have, quote, tamed the West, uh, usually spaced on posts 10 to 12 feet apart. You'll have anywhere from 3 to 5 strands of wire, depending upon the type of animal you're trying to keep in the pasture and the type of predator you're trying to keep out of the pasture. We have the woven wire fence. These have been around, quite popular, particularly in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. Had to get that right. And they can work out very well, come in a variety of different styles, consists of horizontal smooth wires held apart by vertical wires called stays. The spacings can be variable. They can be all the same spacing. They can be such as is shown in this illustration from the University of Georgia. They can be narrower at the bottom, which can help keep small animals, young animals, and small predators out. There are the mesh fences. We see these a lot sometimes with horses, but they can also be quite good if you have a bad predator problem, or you're trying to keep small pasture animals in an area and they aren't sticking their heads through the fence. Um, Strong, great safety for the animals. It's why they're used a lot in the horse industry. And then last type of fence I'm going to mention is the high tensile wire fence. And this is really the most common fence that we now use for perimeter fencing of permanent pastures. It has a long life. It has a lower cost, and that's what's important. These smooth wires, and they can vary once again from 3 to 7 wires. This is a 5-wire fence here. Once again, it depends on your predator pressure and the type of animal you're wanting to keep within the fence. Such as goats and sheep, you need more wires for them because they like this, their little heads can stick between wires, and so you have to have a close spacing of those wires. When I said it's under tension, uh, they're on the right side of the brace posts. On your screen, you'll see those little items. Those are tensioners. And so we use those in combination with a stiff inline tension spring so that we can maintain tension on the wire. Yet if something like a tree branch falls on top of it, it doesn't snap, but it gives and absorbs that shock. And it also, by putting those spring tensioners in there, you don't have to go out and tension the fence every few weeks after an animal is leaned against it. These fences can also be electrified or partially electrified, depending upon your livestock and your predators. So with that in mind, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, on your perimeter fence. So this is why, particularly with goats and sheep and their young animals, including calves, it is so important that we pay attention that when we put up our fences, that the animals cannot get their heads through these fences. Because if you take a look at the billy goat there on the upper left picture with those horns, that head may slide out so easily between the wires, but when he goes to pull his head back in, he'll get it caught on the wire and he'll stay there all day because he's trapped. And so, and you can, the sheep there on the lower right corner, you can lose an animal if they stay down like that, because they soon particularly sheep, they can soon give up and die. And so you just need to pay attention and get the right fence for the right animal you're trying to keep in, and for the predator you're trying to keep out. So predator fences are absolutely necessary. With doing a good job of managed grazing or rotational grazing or some combination of those. We use electric interior fences. Here with goats and sheep, we tend to rely on the netting. Now, however, for cattle, a single strand of electrified wire does a magnificent job, and we'll keep those animals within their section of the pasture just fine, and they're trained to it. They don't test it. It works amazingly well, and you just use step-in posts, very quick to move, and away you go. So now, some considerations. You've got to think about the fence. Now, that piece of land is your pasture or going to be your pasture or could be your pasture, you have some things that you're going to need to be thinking about, inquiring about, and looking for. If you have a new pasture, you're going to have to decide what species you're going to plant. You're going to have to buy quality seed. There's going to have to be some site preparation, whether it's no-till planted or whether it's planted by tillage, using tillage and then drilling using a conventional drill or broadcasting and incorporating. There's going to have to be some type of site preparation. For no-till, that would mean you're going to have to kill the existing vegetation. And for site preparation, and for the more conventional style, that means there's going to have to be some kind of tillage, and then planting. And we always want to make sure that we have a vegetation free planting area, whether it's no-till or whether it's conventional. We don't want there to be anything growing, if at all possible, in that space when we're trying to get those new small seeded plants established. Finally, with a new pasture, you get it planted, your work is not over. You're still going to have to nurse that young pasture along, keep any broadleaf weeds that may be competing with it, keep them mowed down because that pasture is going to need 4 weeks. New pasture is going to require a minimum of 4 weeks of growth. The grass needs to get at least 6 inches tall before you can turn animals in there, because once again, if you turn them in when the plants are young, they'll trample them, they'll kill them, and you'll have wasted a lot of time and money. Finally, on a new pasture, what does your fencing look like? Do you have old fencing? Do you have to put in new fencing? And what type of water sources are available? If you're taking over an old or established pasture, or a land that was once used as a pasture, you're going to have to go out there and visually walk over the land or cross over the land and catalog all the different plants you have out there, because you're going to have desirable plants, you're going to have undesirable plants, and you may have poisonous plants. And you need to know this before you turn animals in there, and that'll help you develop a plan. If there is fencing around this old pasture, what condition is it? Will it keep an animal in, and will it keep a predator out? Uh, you need to look at that. And then the watering system. What is available for water for those animals? Is it on site? Are you going to have to carry it there? That needs to be looked at as well. That with this old or established pasture you're thinking about using, you're going to probably have to develop some kind of a renovation plan. There may be thin areas. There may be areas that are weedy. And weedy, I mean, this could be with scrub kind of brush in there, such as young trees, brambles, a variety. The birds do a great job planting a variety of things if we leave the land fallow. So you need to, once again, when you're out there cataloging, take a look at this, and then you're going to have to decide on how you're going to remove these undesirable plants. You're going to do it chemically. You're going to bring goats in. What are you going to do? You need to get this in mind before you ever put an animal out there. Finally, it's replacing or repairing the old fencing and watering, so you make sure it's all up to standards to hold animals in and to provide them with water before the animals ever get there. Poisonous plants. We do have them in Illinois. We have white snakeroot, but we also have poison hemlock. We have pokeweed, where the berries are poisonous, and the plant becomes poisonous as it gets older. If you have horses, they can choke on a walnut. There's also toxicity with leaves. Most of the time when we have problems with poisonous plants is we haven't been managing the pasture well, or there isn't enough pasture for the animals and they're starving, and so they're just going to eat anything that is green or appears to be green. And so this is when we get into issues. But once again, it's part of the management. You need to be watching these things and keeping track of what's happening out there, particularly in those areas that aren't being grazed well. So we gotta have the land, whether it's going to be a new pasture, an old pasture that we're going to be grazing in. We need to take a soil test. We need to know what's going on out there in the soil. Is the soil actually going to be able to sustain the plants? Yes, once we turn the animals out there, there will be a recycling of their waste. But if the grass or the forage is not growing well to start with, your expectations on what the pasture will be able to supply will not live up to your expectations. pH, we want a minimum of 6 for grasses. For legumes, a grass legume mix, 6.5. 6.7 for alfalfa, and that's particularly if we're trying to interseed alfalfa into a grass stand. It needs that to get off and going well. Once it's established, 6.5 is fine for an established alfalfa grass mix. Uh, we need to have the optimum phosphorus test and the optimum K test. The good news is that when you take soil samples uh, and you send them to a lab, all labs will ask you uh, what this what this land is going to be used for. Is it going to be used for crops? Is it going to be used for forage, vegetables, etc.? You want to put down it's going to be used for a pasture or forage, and that way they will tailor the recommendations for the proper pH, P, and K that are needed for that land, because there's different requirements depending on what's growing there. So you got this land, you've gone out and you've determined what's growing out there. Now, does that match with what you're planning on putting out there to graze? Uh, we have animals that are considered grazers, such as horses, uh, cattle. They really like to eat grass, maybe a little legumes, browse. I'm talking about woody plants. They're not interested in it all. In fact, they will eat those only out of desperation. Browsers, those are the goats, deer, uh, that group of animals. They love stemmy, high lignin type of plant material to feed on. If you have tall weeds out in a field that none of the animals will eat, goats love them. And so that's where goats shine. They love plant foliage, stems, the leaves, and they, for the most part, don't care about grass. But we have a few goat breeds, such as the Boer goats. They've been developed to graze on grass. So know what your animal is before you put them out there. And then there are the intermediates. And this is sheep. Sheep are kind of the intermediates. Uh, they like grass. They like forbs. They like they like that variety. Browse, not as much. So they're fall in that group. All right. So you've decided you're going to do some planting, whether you're going to be renovating the old pasture or planting a new pasture. So when's the time to do that? Well, it kind of depends where you are in the state of Illinois. Spring seedings in the northern part of the state uh, are preferred typically. And it's early spring. So we're talking, and this is a short window. We're talking just 2 or 3 weeks from the middle of March to possibly the middle of April. So once again, it'll depend on what Mother Nature gives us. Late seedings can also work, but only if the soils have moisture. If the soil is dry, putting the seed out there and praying it's going to rain may work, but it may not work as well. And then that seed out there in the ground, it becomes expensive feed for the wildlife. Central Illinois, we actually, in Central Illinois, we recommend more of the late summer planting if possible. Our springs tend to be wet down here, and we have a terrible time getting things planted in the spring. But once again, so if we're in a drought, you may have to plant in the spring. And when I mean late summer, for us, that's typically uh, the last week of August till the middle of September. Uh, and then far southern Illinois, uh, their season is late summer is really the preferred season for them to plant because they have a lot of clay soils that don't drain well and that flood in the spring. And so late summer is a preferred time down there. And that is really uh, the last 3 weeks of September is kind of the preferred time, depending where you are in southern Illinois. As far as what to plant, we have all kinds of different mixtures. Whether you're now, if you're going to have a horse pasture, bluegrass, and creeping white clover, because horses are notorious close grazers, and both those species can tolerate the close grazing. Even if you move them, they are still going to graze low. That's just the way the animal is. Uh, Now, for cattle and sheep, uh, we think more of uh, brome grass uh, in northern Illinois with a legume, alfalfa or clover. Uh, we typically say we use alfalfa on our well-drained soils, and our soils that may not drain quite as well, that's where clover will shine. Uh, Trefoils and Lespedeza can work, but they're slow to establish. Poorly drained soils, things change. We tend to look at Alsike clover. It can tolerate water. One of the improved reed grass, reed canary grass, they're low in alkaloids, are good. Tall fescue, but the new novel endophyte fescue, not old Kentucky 31 that's cheap, because it has endophytes which cause premature abortion in cattle and horses, and can possibly be a problem in sheep and goats, but not to the extent of cattle and horses. So we have all kinds of things out there. And for droughty soils, alfalfa and tall fescue work really well. Alfalfa loves dry. It just needs moisture to get started. Pasture species, as I've alluded to, sheep and goats, they love diversity in their forage. Goats like a lot of diversity or prefer it. Sheep, they like to have a mixture of grass and broadleaves, and possibly brassicas as well in there. Cattle, they like grass legume mix, but also they will eat the brassicas too. Cool season grasses with a forb, that's kind of our standby for the state and for a permanent pasture. So we'll have the alfalfa and clover. Uh, Tall fescue tends to be in the southern 40% of Illinois. That gets into the fescue belt. And for there, we talk about using the new improved fescues, and we have special management programs. If you have the old Kentucky 31 out there, there are ways to manage that with cattle and horses as well. It just takes a different style of management, and that can be handled as well. Orchard grass or brome grass are typical go-to cool season grasses for the northern 2/3 of the state. Red clover or alfalfa are the go-to legumes, unless it's poorly drained areas. We have supplemental forages. Say you know you have a droughty spot. That may be where, and you know nothing particularly grows there very well, but in the spring, it's always greens up because there's moisture. This may be a place where you want to put something like a pearl millet, a sorghum Sudan grass, something in there that will be green and growing during the heat of the summer. We're using a lot now of small grains and brassicas such as turnips and radish, planted in the fall in possibly land that's adjoining the pasture. Uh, so to provide supplemental feed through the winter, because uh, the brassicas grow extremely fast in the fall. Give them 6 weeks of growth, and they're ready. They're ready to provide enough food for 2 months. And the small grains green up extremely early in the spring, and you have a lush early forage before your main pastures green up. Browse. If you've got a lot of trees and shrubs and scrub in there, goats. Now, if you have an established pasture and it may be all grass and you're wanting to get some legumes in there because they provide nitrogen for the grass, as well as have a little higher protein for your livestock when they're grazing, frost seeding works quite well. We're actually approaching, at least in central Illinois, the end of the frost seeding season, because we need that time of the year when our temperatures go down go down into the upper 20s or lower, yet during the day rise up above freezing, so that we have that sloppy kind of wet layer on top of the ground for a little while. We go out, we use a broadcast seeder. It can be put on the back of a four-wheeler. You can go out and use one by hand. I've done it. I've done both ways. It works. You do it in early morning while the ground is frozen. It warms up. That seed is kind of sucked in to the soil, and the seed is ready to germinate when the temperature is right. Works out quite well for filling in some thin spaces in thin areas in more established pastures. We can't forget, these animals are going to need, they have nutritional needs. Water. A mature cow in a beef cow will drink 18 to 20 gallons a day in the heat of the summer. It's a lot of water. Dairy cows, 10 gallons more than that. Sheep and goats, 1 to 4 gallons depending upon their age and size. And horses, once again, depending on the size, 8 to 12 gallons per day. This is something you need to take into consideration when you have animals out there. They're going to have water, even if they have shade and it's hot. They're going to need the water because they're going to be panting, they're going to be sweating, they're going to need that water. We also need to worry about crude protein. We need to manage that. Animals need protein, particularly growing animals and animals that are nursing. They need protein. They need high protein. And of course, energy. And this can come in the form of our soluble sugars, our non-structured carbohydrates. But since we're grazing, we're going to have animals that have stomachs that allow fermentation, multi-chambered stomachs, or in the case of horses, uh, they have adaptations to their intestines that allow for fermentation. And so for them, they can digest cellulose and hemicellulose. Lignin, on the other hand, would that isn't digested. And what we need to remember is any plant, the more mature it gets a higher lignin and cellulose content. And cellulose, if it's high in cellulose, it's low in protein, and it's much harder for the animal to digest. Another thing to keep in mind is if you have a cool season pasture, you have more growth in the spring than you can use. But by the middle of the summer, the animals are starving because, once again, these animals shut down. I mean, not these animals, these plants shut down typically when the temperature reaches 90 degrees. They just kind of go dormant out there, waiting for cooler temperatures and less stress. So this is where sometimes planting that legume in there can help out on a grass pasture. This is where alfalfa shines because it's deep rooted and will continue to grow. This is where sometimes people will interseed something or sometimes have a warm season annual grasses mixed in or in a portion of the pasture. Say the place where the animals were kept during the winter time when they were fed and it's kind of a sacrifice area. This could be an area that in the spring, when you turn the animals out into the permanent pasture, that you could reseed to something like a sorghum sudan grass, a millet. Uh, it could even be for short rotation. It could even be a turnip or radish, although they don't take the heat particularly well. Fall of the year, sometimes, the pastures, particularly a cool season pasture, it still isn't up to the same ability as it was in the early spring, but it's recovering. This could be a time when, once again, if you have that sacrifice area, that you go in and seed that to spring oats and radish or spring oats and turnips. Keep the animals out of it until it gets established, and then you can turn them into that and they can feed on that and give your pasture some rest in September and October, and then turn the animals back out again in November. We have all kinds of different things we can do. Growing and maturity. If you notice on grasses, we want to have the animals grazing before they begin to head out. We definitely want them in there before you see seed heads. When you see seed heads, that is when the digestibility goes way down and the animals look for other things to eat. For our legumes, the key thing with them, because they're typically higher in protein, is that we want to get them, we want to have be grazing them before they get into full bloom, because when they reach full bloom and they have more stem, which once again is harder to digest, and fewer leaves, which is where the protein is. And so you've got this tall leggy plant, but once again, the animals are only eating the top of it and they're trampling the rest of it down. Continuous and rotational grazing or managed grazing. Yes, you can turn the animals out there. That's the lower line, that solid line, and it's fine, but you're only going to utilize about a third of the available forage out there. Where if we manage the animals and move them periodically across the pasture, allowing the ungrazed areas to recover, we reach levels of 70%, or we get double or more than double the utilization. So an acre of land that is continuously grazed will support one 1,000 pound animal, which is considered one animal unit. Now that may be 5 or 6 sheep, 8 or more goats. It may be a part of a cow, depending on what breed of cow you have. It could be part of a horse, depending on the horse. But if we do rotational grazing, we can take that from one animal unit of 1,000 pounds per acre to 2, and even more, depending how well we do it. There are people grazing that move their animals twice a day. I mean, it's pretty incredible. But they have really high stocking levels, a number of animals per acre, but it takes a lot of management. So grazing height, you turn them out there. I talked about not overgrazing. So what is overgrazing? Well, for orchard grass, that's 3 inches. You get orchard grass down to 2 inches. It doesn't take it 4 weeks to recover. It takes 6 to 8 weeks to recover. And while you think you're not going to be buying hay, if you put the animals out there and let it just eat it down to the ground, the fact is that you're still going to be buying hay, because it's going to take months for the pasture to recover, not a few weeks. Kentucky bluegrass, 1 to 2 inches. You can take it down to that first joint on your index finger, and it'll do fine. Tall fescue, it's like most of our other cool season grasses, 3 to 4 inches. Our legumes, they can tolerate, for the most part, 2 to 3 inches. They don't do well below that at all. In fact, they will disappear. We have some other grasses in here. This came from Kentucky. Our annual warm season grasses. There are people that graze on native grasses. These grasses, their regrowth doesn't come from the crown. It actually comes from above ground growth. And so we like to keep a minimum of 6 inches of growth if we're out there with our native grasses, which do extremely well. And we have some very nutritious native grasses, but they just have to be grazed at a taller level. Watering system. Do you have a stream or pond? If you do, please limit the access. Livestock standing out in the stream in the summertime, quote, cooling off, they're also defecating in that stream, and they may be passing disease to the other animals. So keep that in mind. Plus, the other thing is the stream bank destruction. We end up running the stream bank down. We have increased erosion. Limit the access. This can be done with permanent fencing. It can even be done with a couple of corral panels that you attach to permanent fence posts and the fence line that just stick out into the stream. The animals have a little access to get water, but they can't get out into the stream and muck it up. Do you have a permanent? You're going to need a watering system anywhere you have animals in kind of a permanent situation, such as a winter feeding area, up near the barn, up near the shelter for the animals. If you have a lambing or a calving area, you're going to need some type of permanent watering in there. And for pastures, we're really recommending, and have been for the past quarter century, the idea of using portable watering, because research has shown that if animals travel more than 800 feet and definitely 1,000 feet, particularly if you're raising growing animals, they expend so much energy walking back and forth to the water in the summertime. They have zero net gain in weight, because they're spending all their energy walking back and forth. And so 800 feet, more or less, is considered the sweet spot that an animal should travel to water. We have all kinds of, let me go back. We have all kinds of different ways of doing this as far as portable watering. We have tubs, permanent watering. We have waterers that require heaters. We have what they could call the bottomless waterers, which are waterers that are sunk deep into the ground, and they use uh, the ground temperature, the heat of the ground to keep them frost free. We have a variety of different ways to go with these things. Nipple waterers, there's all kinds of things. Portable waterers, like I said, we have the tubs that are easy to drag around. Portable watering systems that you can feed with a hose from a hydrant or an above ground water line. Lots of people use above ground watering lines until it gets cold, and then they roll it up, and sometimes that's when they pull the animals back into the barn. If you're going to be grazing year round, which is possible in southern Illinois, central Illinois, we can do it 9 to 11 months out of the year. This year, we might be able to do it 12. We've had so little snow, but it's typically depth of snow, which is the limiting factor on whether the animals can graze out there. And so if that's the case, then portable watering can work out quite well for a good portion of the year, and you need a more permanent buried system for something like that. So in conclusion, I don't know how I managed to do that. In conclusion, in conclusion, our goal is to have happy animals growing on nice, lush forage that are doing well, sustaining well, and you're making a profit. That's what it's all about. And as you can see, and this is the lower picture is a goat feeding on sorghum Sudan grass. Goats love sorghum Sudan grass in the summertime. And of course, I couldn't have it without a picture of lambs in the springtime. So if you have any questions, there's my contact information. I know Grant has given you access to this slide set. So take it away.
Right. So before we go to questions, I am going to launch our demographic poll. As mentioned at the start today, this is voluntary and completely anonymous, but we just do this after every extension program. So if you have any other questions about Doug's presentation, put them in the chat box, and we've got some time to get to them.
Yes. Or if you, yes. Oh, Nikki's on. Okay. Oh, Sarah Farley's listening. Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, you've got some friends on here.
Yeah, I know. Oh, okay.
Are you doing any grazing on your own farm, Doug, or
Uh, I did up until my hands got so bad with my arthritis.
okay?
And then handling animals just didn't work out as well as it used to. But yeah, I grazed sheep. I had a market lamb business,
Hmm.
and so what we found out, I started farming back in the heyday of the late 70s, which is kind of like the heyday of the late 2000s was 2009, 10, 11, 12 was here recently. But then things got tough in a few years later. And so I was looking to bring another source of income in, and there was a true need for market lambs in downstate down here. And so I had a market lamb business where I sold lambs, cuts of lamb, and all of that. We did that for 2 decades, over 2 decades.
Uh,
So,
we had a question come in the chat box. So do you ever fertilize pasture? Is that a practice you would do?
well, and this is something that's important to keep in mind. If you have a pure grass stand pasture, you may you're going to have to you may have to add nitrogen occasionally, because once again, if you're growing animals and selling them, you're exporting you're exporting nutrients off the land. Now, if you got a horse out there, you may have a self-sustaining system because nothing's leaving the land. Uh, Everything the horse deposits, everything that is fed is going back to the land. So that's it. And that's another reason why we put legumes, like to have legumes in a pasture. Bad news about legumes is the animals like them better than grass because they're more palatable. They have more leafy, soft leafy area, and they're higher in nutrition, higher in protein. And so we typically are going to have to reseed them, and that's where we talk about frost seeding, um, about every 3 years. It could be a little longer. It could be a little longer, but it tends to be about 3 years. Our grasses, they tend to be there once we get them established, unless we overgraze them or abuse them. Um, they're there forever
Hmm.
practically. And so we just need to keep that in mind. And if we have an established pasture that has almost entire grass and you're wanting to put legumes or begin to get legumes in there, that would be the time in the late fall to overgraze that, take that pasture down to 3 inches, get it down there short going into the winter. Because we're going to want to stress that grass, which we wouldn't recommend in a real pasture, in a regular pasture. But if trying to introduce the legumes in, we want to get it down low. We want that grass to go into the winter with not quite as many reserves as we typically like in it. And that way, when we frost seed in late, depending where we are in the state, from late January to early March, uh, those legume seeds, whether it's alfalfa or one of the clovers, uh, they begin to germinate and the grass isn't near as vigorous and they have a chance of surviving. And, and so you can do it that way very easily without having to come in and bring heavy equipment such as a tractor and disc to tear the sod up and then broadcast seed into. And even that sometimes is doesn't work quite as well as we like, because if we get a heavy rain, the sod goes back solid and the poor seedling legumes never have a chance.
Sure. Sarah had a question. How do you suggest transitioning a high tensile fencing system for a beef herd to goats?
Oh, well, if I had a 5 wire high tensile system, it for goats, it would have to be a 7 wire system. And a 7 wire system typically has the lower wires, the lower few wires, 3 wires at a 6 inch spacing, or at the lower wires, lower 3 wires at a 6 inch spacing. And then we begin to space them out as we go higher up. Uh, Up the fence, the height of the fence. And depending on your predator pressure, you may even run a top wire across the top of the posts if you have coyotes that can clear 5 foot fences.
Uh,
You may want to put a hot wire on top. Uh, they really don't like getting singed when they get up that high in the air. But yeah, that works. You just end up just altering your wire spacing and adding a couple more wires, and it can work. I mean, and it does work as long as you keep it tensioned. It works. Our high tensile fences, they're wonderful. and they cut the cost. They do cut the cost, and compared to a woven wire or mesh fence.
We have another question. That Dave asked, on some hilly ground I've cleared, there is some moss growing among the grass. Is there anything that can be done about this to remove the moss?
Well, that moss is telling you something. For moss to grow, it has to be, there has to be constant moisture, because moss really doesn't have a root system. So that ground has to stay wet. And so uh, the reason it's there is because it's so wet. Now, could you plant something that's more tolerant, uh, or, or or likes wet areas? Alsike clover takes a while to get established. Could be something if you tore up the moss areas, used tillage and tore up those moss areas. Um, the improved reed canary grass does well in moist areas, which is why NRCS introduced reed canary grass back in the 40s to help stabilize uh, creeks and ditch banks. But unfortunately, that was a high alkaloid type of reed canary grass, and that isn't particularly consumed well by ruminants, by most animals. But we have new improved reed canary grasses, and they're great. They're great, work really good. So that would be it. But I would try to understand what the issue is. It's either too wet or too shady, because moss has to have moisture to grow.
We have another question. What about co-grazing species? Do you
Oh,
wait?
oh,
Let me do the question again. What co-grazing species do you recommend to manage parasite problems?
ah, for managing parasite problems, and yes, this is an issue. And if we're going to manage internal parasites, particularly with our small ruminants, goats and sheep and alpacas, etc., we need to, once again, make sure that there is a long rest period in there, because we want those eggs that are hatched to die, to not survive out there. So cattle work well, can work well in that situation with either goats or sheep. They work well together. And they also eat, they have a slightly different preference in what they like to eat. And so if you've got some more leafy, broadleaf, uh, weedy type things like our docks or whatever, the sheep and the goats, they'll be attracted to those, where the cattle, not so much. And that works out well. But that's a kind of a sequential grazing can work out. Now, once you get your internal parasite pressure down, they can be grazed together. But once again, it takes management if you're going to graze together, to make sure one species isn't overgrazing a particular uh, a forage out there in the pasture. So just requires a little bit, it requires extra management, but it can work out really well with either grazing together or grazing them one following the other. But always have a rest period in there. That's crucial, and particularly as we're running into more and more uh, worm internal parasites that are resistant to wormers from our overuse of wormers. And of course, do FAMACHA testing if you have small ruminants, so you know what load your animals have in them to start with.
Doug, I don't see any more questions in our chat box. We've had a good range of questions to put you on the spot with. So,
Yeah, yeah,
and
I
I
know.
know how it is, right?
That's right. It wouldn't be that's why we're in extension. We
That's
we
why.
love we love the hot seat.
Uh-huh. Well, we thank you for joining us tonight, Doug, with your great presentation. And thank you all for being with us tonight as well. As mentioned, I will upload it to our YouTube channel. We will share that link with you. And then we will also send you a link promoting next month's webinar on meat goat production on Thursday, March 16th with Sarah Farley. So with that, have a great night. Be safe out there. For those that are still dealing with electricity issues, we hope your electricity can be restarted much sooner than later. So
I
great night.
agree.